So up today is Kelly Broderick, who is a therapist / counsellor, and she's going to be talking to us about her work in the Black community. There's a lot to come, so stay tuned. Can't wait for you to see this episode. So I know that you see that the work that you do as a counsellor is something that you want to help, particularly the Black community. Is that something that you felt always, or just when you started counselling?
So that's a two-pronged question for me. So even in childhood and just my experiences with my family, there's been a significant amount of trauma, and trauma hasn't been resolved. It's just passed down.
Yes.
But it looks different as it passes down. It manifests itself differently. And I then started to think, hold on a second, because there are many of us that are telling exactly the same story. We've gone through very similar experiences. And I'm thinking, at what point do we stop?
Ugh.
At what point does it stop? When I started working in kind of the social care field, specifically when I started working quite closely with CAMS, which is the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, a lot of our people, our community, are accessing those services. Now, you know, there's a lot of white middle class, mainly women, but some men, that are the therapists, that, you know, they are the professionals in those in those services. I never forget sitting in a meeting for one of my families, and I'd already, you know, had a really in-depth conversation with the family. I've written quite a detailed assessment, and I understood some of their isms and schisms because I'm from the same community. So it made sense, because what was happening within the family and the way how they were trying to kind of manage certain things, it wasn't working. And now other services were now involved. And I sat in on a CAMS meeting where there was psychotherapists, family therapists, you know, and they made they were making these formulations. So formulation is trying to understand what the issue and how are we going to address it. And they were making these statements and coming up with these thoughts that were the complete opposite of what was actually going on with the family. Being the only Black woman in the room, and actually I was the family worker, I had to speak up and I had to say, no, actually I would say that's inaccurate. Because actually, in terms of our community, sometimes our intention is pure, but maybe the methodology probably isn't right, but that's not what they're trying to do. You know, this is based on what they've experienced when they were children. So they're just trying to do the best and trying to utilize values and morals that they probably grew up with, that they think actually it worked for me, to then use on their children, and it wasn't working. So for me, I was already in the throes of training anyway, but that just kind of opened it up to me to say, Kelly, this is why you're doing the work that you're doing. This is exactly why. I need to be able to be sitting at those big tables and having those discussions. I work mainly with ethnic minority groups. Do you know what I mean? That's been the basis of my work for the most of my career. Some of these therapists, they have no understanding what it's like to be in poverty. They have no understanding what it's like, you know, to move from one country to another country and having to kind of, you know, to figure it out, and to be traumatized and to be racially abused, and, you know, they have no understanding of that. And that's not a negative on them, because you know what, our experiences are our experiences, but we need to be able to hold the space and open up our thinking a bit and say, do you know what, I don't understand. Teach me, tell me, what is it like to be in your community?
So do you think on the part of the NHS, and I'm not saying anything negative, I'm not bagging on the NHS, because I think it is a fantastic service, but do you think that there is a lack of understanding around people's background and how that might affect their therapy? Do you think that the NHS needs to be more aware about tailoring the help that they give to meet the needs of people?
Absolutely. So the NHS, they are a fantastic service. So in terms of mental health, the mental health service is, you know, it's in problems. It's at crisis point. They're not managing. There are more traumatized people that are coming and looking for support and therapy probably than there have been at any other time in life. Whether it's more people or whether it's a fact that mental health we're debunking kind of the whole taboo around mental health, and people actually feeling more comfortable to come forward. But the NHS, the first thing that they offer is CBT. Now, CBT has its place, so that's cognitive behavior therapy. It has its place. However, they offer maybe, if you're lucky, 6 to 12 sessions. I've had many families that I've worked with where they've done the 6 to 12 sessions and they're still depressed. You know, they can't do nothing. They can't leave their house. They can't move forward. But actually what they need is some long-term therapy, you know, that's going to really help them to address some of that unconscious stuff. The NHS, I don't know if it's a case of they don't, you know, they don't understand, or whether it's just that they don't have the money to offer lots of different types of therapy. The services is not, it's not that it's not available, but, you know, a lot of people can't afford it. They can't afford the kind of therapy that they need. So, or there's long waiting lists for intense therapy.
So when is the time for somebody to reach out and say that they need help or they need someone to speak to?
Obviously, it depends on where people are at in their journey, isn't it? I would kind of question people. If people have got questions about the pattern that their life is going in, that's a good time to then start to maybe explore, why is it that my life is going in this way? Why is it that I seem to be attracting these kind of people? Why is it that I can't move forward in my career, whatever? Somebody might suggest to you, maybe you should talk to somebody once you feel, I want more, but I don't know how to get more. Yeah. If you've got those kind of questions, then maybe that's probably a good time to then think about addressing what's underneath that. Do you know what I mean? If you stick with the process and if you're with the right kind of therapist to contain you, you can get through it.
So when we were prepping for this interview, you actually said 2 statements that I found extremely profound, but I also found them very uncomfortable. So I just want to talk about them and just to get an understanding of what you meant. So the first one was that as Black people, we come from a lot of trauma. And number 2 was, as Black people, we need to start exploring our own wounds.
So just looking at in terms of migration for us, we've, you know, many of us, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents weren't born here. Now, there would have been a significant amount of racism. Let's be really honest. Racism. Yeah. So racism in this country, but also in their, you know, if they're going back to their country, slavery, that in itself is trauma. Yeah. So those are wounds. We may not recognize it in 2020 because that was back in 1850, 1864. But those things are still carried down. It is important for us to even to look at even our family functioning. So why do I do the things that I do? Well, with all my clients, I do genograms. Now, a genogram is like a family tree. Family trees, depending on how much you know about your family and you understand the kind of relationship dynamics between different family members on each side of your family, that can tell you a lot about what was happening in your family tree. Yeah, it tells you a lot. And if you really check it and if you look at things going, from maybe great grandparents, if you're lucky, great grandparents, you'll start to understand patterns. There's certain patterns that might come through, that have come through to you, but you might not even be aware of it at all. It may not even cross your mind. And those are wounds. Those are wounds that, we do have to kind of look at. Things like domestic violence. Yeah. Domestic violence is an abomination. Always has been. However, if you look, even, as recent parents and grandparents generation, where there might be members who giving a woman a slap or something like, was seen as normal, that is trauma. And children witnessing domestic abuse is on the category of emotional abuse. Before that became a category on the children's social care threshold, I remember working with families where they have been survivors or they've experienced significant domestic abuse. And we say, where were the children when all of this was happening? They were in their beds. They didn't know what was going on. You best to believe they knew exactly what was going on.
Now, this might be a generalization, but I felt that as growing up as a Black woman in my family, there was a lot of pride that they tried to instill us with, that I feel very fortunate about. I feel very lucky to have experienced, especially in a country where you're not the norm, and where your race or your culture isn't celebrated, especially growing up. But with that sense of pride that we have, I think it comes with a sort of reluctance sometimes to talk about difficult things that have happened in the past. Like, and again, I'm generalizing. So when you need to start doing this work, when you need to start asking those questions and of yourself and of your family, how do you do the work without hurting those around you?
So for me personally, I pretty much did my work pretty much on my own. I know a lot of my family history anyway. You know, I'd asked my mum, my grandparents 6 years ago. I got the opportunity to sit down with her and speak to her about when she left my dad and my aunt back in Jamaica. What was life like for her when she was growing up as a girl in the very early 30s? And, you know, and how did you feel? She lost a child before my dad was born, I think probably about a year or two. And then she had my dad. And I said, Grandma, how did you feel when you lost your baby? Your little girl, she was only 2. Well, you know, them days we didn't, you know, you just don't know. They're just, you know, children, and sometimes them just die, you know, and you don't know the reason why. Oh, you know, for me, I'm clutching my pearls, and, you know, I've got my 1-year-old next to me, and I'm just thinking, for me, I couldn't even begin to even imagine what that was like. Yes, it was something that was very common, but is it any less traumatic because it was common? No.
So when you're talking about trauma, so physical trauma, emotional trauma, sexual trauma, is it possible to undo it in counselling?
When you say to undo it, because whatever is done is done.
Okay, all right, so let me explain that a bit further. When I say undo it, is it possible to stop the impact it has on your actions and the way that you behave? You might get to a point where you're like, actually, I used to react in anger because of this emotional trauma that I've gone through. Is it possible to change things through counselling and to kind of move away from reacting to the trauma that you've experienced during your life?
Yeah. But that's the whole part of the work. It's to create new habits. It's about creating healthier patterns, you know what I mean, going forward. I've always said what I said to me when I started doing my work and started to recognize certain really unhealthy things that was happening. I said that the trauma, everything, it has to end here. It has to end with me, because I don't want to carry that on to my children. So what does that then require? It requires me to do something different. It requires me to build some new habits. Do you know what I mean? And that's not an easy thing to do, because you can't just say, okay, I recognize that in myself, that I get really angry and I blow up, and I'm not going to do it anymore. You know, you've got to build a habit. You've got to build some scaffolding around it. But once we start to recognize and we understand the triggers, we start to recognize, right, I know when I'm starting to get irritated, this is what happens. What can I do to try and diffuse that? Okay, we go to the next level when, you know, my face is starting to get red, you know, we're in a really heated debate. What do I do in this setting? Can I remove myself? Can I say, do you know something? I'm starting to struggle to be able to engage in this conversation right now. I think maybe we need to end it at this point in time and maybe come back to it at a later point. That takes time. It takes time, and you're not always gonna get it, you know what I mean, every time. It definitely can change in terms of patterns, in terms of particular things that you want to change. You can change it, but it starts within first.
And I think what you said there is just so important, like this idea of hope. Change can happen, and I guess to also know that change isn't linear. So it's not going to be a straight path, you know, it's going to be up and down, backwards and forwards. You might have to redo things again. It might feel like you're taking 2 steps forwards and 3 steps back, but if you stick with the process, if you do the work, if you're patient and you're dedicated, that change can happen. And I really want people to take that thought away with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do people build strong mental health and, you know, strong mental resilience?
So building strong mental resilience and strong mental health is, you have to give yourself compassion. You've got to be compassionate with yourself. So not every day is going to be a good day.
Yeah.
You know, again, it's about managing your expectations. And when those days are not great, I allow myself to feel what I need to feel. And sometimes, and that's hard at first, to be able to allow yourself to feel what you feel, because what happens is with your feelings, you're trying to stop it, but there's also you give yourself lots of judgments. Yeah, you judge yourself. I shouldn't be feeling like this. Why should I be feeling like this? I should be, you know, you start to beat yourself up. But one thing that I try and encourage people to do is to allow themselves to feel what they need to feel. Don't try to resist it. Let it come and let it flow through you and let it pass out. Because I think when you try to restrict it and you try to, you know what I mean, try to distance yourself from it, what happens is you then delay the inevitable. But it's a fight, it's a battle, so you're still not going to be happy. Write it down. Write down, this is how I feel. I feel like this. You know, maybe ask yourself questions. Why do you feel like this? I feel like this because, you know, you write it down. And then maybe the last question that you ask yourself is it true? Is it true? And then, you know, you can write down, you know, whether you think it's true. 9 times it's not true. Do you know what I mean? Usually it's how you're feeling, it's your perception. Do you know what I mean? I guarantee if you will go to tell somebody else what you're feeling and how you're feeling, they might see it, they're probably going to see it differently to yourself. And then what I then try and do is write down positive things about myself that I recognize in myself. I value myself. I love me. I am lovable. I am valuable. You know, those things.
Have you found during counselling that a lot of people don't actually feel that they could write that list of positive things?
It takes time. Self-love is a bit of a buzzword right now. What is self-love? There's a lot of people that don't even like themselves, far less love themselves. I know, I've been there. If you start to build up yourself to even like yourself, then you're in a good place. Even if you can only find one thing that you like about yourself, that's a start. Because what will happen through the journey, you then start to recognize other really good things about yourself. There will never be another you.
Yeah.
There's only one of you. Yeah. And what you bring is only you can bring it.
So Kelly, I just want to say thank you so much for taking this time to talk to me. Like, I think you have so much insight and wisdom to give, and I'm really glad we were able to take this time to just talk about therapy and counselling, especially in the Black community, like the work that you're doing and just championing people getting help from our own community. I really hope that what people get from this is that counselling is for everybody. But if you have any questions or comments about what you've seen so far, please leave them down below in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I guess I'll see you in another episode of Another Woman.